Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the media and the war in Mali. Stereotypes, spin, and the absence of context. The Venezuelan media are fighting again, this time over the story of a president who's out of the picture, but still in the news. A con man takes the Portuguese news media and their audiences for a ride. And the grim tale of man and the natural world in our web video of the week. It's been a year since the fighting broke out in Mali, but for much of the international news media, this is a story that has only just begun. It all started last January when the Tuareg people in the north, many returning from Libya, where they had been backing Muammar Gaddafi, came home loaded with weapons and an agenda. They started their own rebellion. That led to a military coup that ousted President Amadou Toumani Touré. The rebel forces then merged with other radical groups in the north, trying to break away to form a separate Islamic state. But it was only when the French dispatched troops to their former colony to quell the rebellion that the international media clued into the story. And the factionalized conflict has now been characterized as a brand new Islamic threat. Throw in the hostage drama in neighboring Algeria and the links those groups have to al-Qaeda, and the global media's lens is now focused squarely on Mali. Our starting point this week is on the country's capital, Bamako, and a conflict that finally has journalists talking from here to Timbuktu.
There has been a lack of genuine images at the front line.
Government troops have prevented most foreign journalists from reaching the front line.
The two sides are boiled down simplistically to the French and to the Islamists.
And that's one oversimplification that I think the media has dwelled on.
French warplanes flew in this month when the jihadists tried to push south.
There isn't much nuance that is presented about who the key actors are and what their real motives are.
As story arcs go, the coverage of the fighting in Mali has fallen short in some familiar ways. There is the late arrival of international news organizations into a story that has already been burning for a year now. The coverage of a war in which journalists, at least the vast majority of them, cannot actually report from the war zone because they've been prevented from going in. And the overall lack of one of the most critical components of any journalistic effort, context.
It's clear to me that it was January 11 when the French intervened. It all of a sudden became a story. What has been going on in Mali is serious, but so long as French soldiers were not there and the people being brutalized seemed to be just Malians, the international media seemed to be unconcerned. So obviously, it seems like it's only when it becomes an issue for European forces, then it becomes a story, and that should not be the case.
So holding that ground is absolutely crucial.
As a whole, what it shows about the media is that the media has become reactive as opposed to proactive, and looking at issues as soon as they become a threat or sensational story that can be directly related to viewers' concerns on Western interests in the region. But the issue has been going on for a while, and the security situation has been degrading in Mali for quite some time.
The way the story began last January, it was very much focused on the Tuareg uprising, and this war was characterized as a Tuareg rebellion. But by May, as the al-Qaeda affiliated groups operating in northern Mali began to undermine the Tuareg rebellion, the media narrative very much changed over to a narrative about the war on terrorism.
It is coming to the aid of...
When news organizations parachute into a story, the largest of them have a way of establishing the narrative. Theirs is the biggest bullhorn. Others cannot help but hear and often echo what is reported. The dominant foreign contingent in Mali is French. Journalists from that former colonial power are reporting to and for an audience in France, even though the French military are limiting their freedom to travel.
Des villes occupées par les islamistes, où les islamistes imposaient la charia.
The French media have adopted to a certain extent the security narrative that has been pushed forward by the French government. It viewed this intervention in Mali as a short-term one which would aim to strengthen the Malian state. And so the French media has aligned itself with that position. but has not necessarily looked at some of the broader debates that surround the intervention, including those of neo-colonial accusations and those of Western states defending their interests in a region that is fragile.
The Malian government broadcast an international alert asking for help, and particularly asking the former colonial power, France, to come in and help them out and stop the Islamist advance. And that's certainly the way the media is telling the story. But the French have also imposed a news blackout. It's very, very hard to get out of the city of Bamako and cover this conflict at the front lines.
This is a real risk, but you know, it's also convenient, I suppose, from the army's point of view, not to have images of exactly what's happening on the ground. Very, very quickly, if public opinion begins to see and get a sense of what war is, which is never pretty, that can turn the very high level of support that this war currently has in France, and that's, I suppose, what France wants to avoid for as long as possible.
80% of Malians speak Bambara as a first or second language. However, the official language is French. That is also the language Malian television channels broadcast in. They are based in the capital. And under the country's new military rulers who took over 10 months ago, media freedom has taken a turn for the worse.
Coverage in the Malian media has had a strong strain of animosity towards the Tuaregs, and that the country has been plunged into war by the Tuaregs and their Islamist friends. But I think it is entirely understandable given the war in the country. A lot of the northern Mali population has been displaced. So these displaced people have taken with them stories of atrocities committed against them by the Islamists, all of which points to the fact that there is a strong anti-Tuareg and anti-Islamist bias in the coverage in the local Malian media.
In Bamako, you've got a largely French-speaking media. You've got websites such as malijet.com, which brings through a lot of the French language print media, such as Le Républicain, the Republican, which is one of the main newspapers in Mali. Le Républicain headlined in the first couple of days of the conflict, François Hollande, the Malian. So you're getting a very positive sense of the French intervention through the French language, Bamako-based for the large part Malian media. If you're to talk about the media in the north of Mali, it's pretty much non-existent.
When foreign powers pull out of their one-time colonies, they inevitably leave a few things behind. A relationship, a language, and in the case of Mali, a media apparatus that communicates in French. Bamako is a long way from Paris, but the two governments speak the same language. And in the coverage of this war, for the most part, their media are telling the same story. Our Global Village voices now on the coverage of the war in Mali.
France are spinning this story in the same way that Britain and America spun their stories when they invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. And this is a continuation of the so-called global war on terror. However, there are critical voices within the media, such as Ceasefire Magazine or Pan Bazooka Press, which is perhaps taking a better approach in recognising that there are certain resources such as uranium, gold and possible oil reserves within the Tuareg region, which borders Mali, Nigeria, Algeria and Libya.
Coverage of the Malian crisis in the mainstream media has been uneven. In English, there's been great work by Afua Hirsch in The Guardian, by Peter Tinty in the Christian Science Monitor, by the Reuters crew, and by Mohamed Val for Al Jazeera English. The French press is important, not only because they're leading the intervention, but because most of the French public supports it. But Le Monde has run some uneven pieces, notably a piece in support of the MNLA on the 19th of January, which was essentially a work of propaganda.
We're always looking for new faces for the program. If you'd like to share your thoughts on the news media as one of our Global Village voices, just get in touch with us on Facebook or send us a tweet. Our Twitter handle is @AJListeningPost. And don't forget our free video podcast on iTunes. Just look for The Listening Post, Al Jazeera English, and you'll find us there. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The last time we talked about Thailand was to examine how journalists are falling afoul of lèse majesté laws that make criticizing the king a criminal offense. This week, yet another reporter has felt the full force of those laws. Somyat Pruek Sakasemsuk has been sentenced to 10 years in jail for an article that he wrote back in 2010 that criticized a fictional character that represented the king. Fictional or not, that was too much for the authorities, who also gave him an additional year for a lesser charge. There's a political edge to this story. Pruek Sakasemsuk is the editor of a magazine called Voice of the Oppressed. He was an activist in Thailand's Red Shirt protest group that supported former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. Thaksin's sister, Yingluck, is the current Prime Minister. She promised to amend lèse majesté laws in her 2011 election campaign, but that promise has run aground due to opposition from monarchists who remain a powerful force in the military and elsewhere in the Thai establishment. 2012 was a grim year when it comes to casualty figures in the media. According to the International Press Institute, a record number of journalists were killed, 119. We're less than a month into 2013, and the bad news continues. 2 journalists have been killed in Syria. Veteran French military correspondent Yves Debay was shot in Aleppo on January 19th, and a Syrian journalist, Mohammed al-Masalma, was killed in Daraa the next day. Yves Debay was traveling with a unit of the Free Syrian Army when he was hit by sniper fire. He'd been reporting for Asso, a French magazine that he founded which specialized in military affairs. Al-Masalma spent the past year based in Daraa reporting for Al Jazeera Arabic. Syria was the most dangerous place in the world for the media last year. 28 journalists died there. The second most perilous country to report from in 2012 was Somalia, with a tally of 18 media deaths. And there's one network in particular that suffered the most casualties, the radio and television broadcaster Shabelle. Abdi Hared Osman Aden, a presenter for Shabelle, was shot dead in Mogadishu on his way to work. Aden was one of very few Shabelle journalists not living on site in the company's offices where there is full-time security. Last year, 3 Shabelle journalists were killed. Many others say that they've been the targets of death threats and intimidation. Somali journalists are trapped in a system where the threats come from all directions, different arms of the government, powerful business interests, and militant groups like Al-Shabaab. Following Aden's death, the National Union of Somali Journalists repeated its call that the government should create a special force for the protection of the country's reporters. The anti-austerity movement in Portugal has lost one of its most prominent voices who, as it turns out, was not who he said he was. Artur Baptista da Silva was a hot commodity in the Portuguese media circuit. He spoke in sound bites, and his credentials seemed impeccable. Da Silva marketed himself as a former advisor to President João Sampaio, as an ex-employee of the World Bank, as a financial researcher for the United Nations, and a professor in the United States. All of that turned out to be false. The darling of media desks in Portugal had never worked for the president. His thesis on growth, inequality, and poverty had been borrowed from the World Bank website, and he was in fact a convicted forgerer who had done jail time in Portugal. Da Silva was called out by the United Nations. They informed a Portuguese television station that he wasn't employed by the UN and never had been. He's currently under investigation for fraud. Da Silva's last public statement was a denunciation of what he called a media witch hunt. For the past month, Venezuelans have been watching a curious and very serious drama unfold on their television screens. At the center of the story is President Hugo Chavez. The man who has dominated politics for more than a decade has been off the air, out of sight for 6 weeks now, but very much in the news. Chavez is reportedly still in Cuba undergoing cancer treatment. In his absence, the president's chair has sat empty, and both sides of Venezuela's deeply polarized media are fighting to control the narrative. State media have been tasked with keeping an absent Chavez in the public eye. It's not easy. Opposition media, who have had it in for this president since the day he took office, are questioning the legality of his government and speculating over whether he will ever return to power. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on the president's failing health, what is at stake politically, and the media battle that is so central to this story.
When Venezuelans would switch on their TVs for Sunday viewing, their president would be there to address them for hours. Allo Presidente was once a fixture of Sunday morning state TV programming. But President Hugo Chavez has been sick, getting treatment in Cuba, and the show has gone off air. However, news of the president still dominates the daily news bulletins in Venezuela.
Esta infección ha derivado en una insuficiencia respiratoria.
Y nuevamente se debe someter a otra intervención quirúrgica en La Habana.
Eso ha sido suspendido el día de hoy.
But in December, one channel went against the official script.
Se procederá a una nueva elección universal, directa y secreta dentro de los 30 días consecutivos siguientes.
What is at stake in terms of the way in which the media are covering the health status of Hugo Chavez within Venezuela is the possibility of, or not, of his party continuing in power. Globovisión condemned the decision which allowed for the postponement of Chávez's inauguration. Globovisión made a reading of the Constitution according to which the absence of Chávez during the inauguration entails the need to activate a process of new elections.
Neither the media nor the Venezuelan public have had enough access to information. We have a right to this information because we're talking about the president of the country.
The government has been transparent in informing the public about the president's illness with communiques and regular press updates. But there's a whole rumor mill being generated by certain media outlets and journalists, and their prime objective is to destabilize the country.
Globovisión has been a thorn in the Chávez government's side for more than a decade.
Si ustedes quieren, señores de Globovisión, seguir llamando a la desobediencia.
In the brief coup of 2002, Globovisión was one of the most prominent media outlets to support the 48-hour government of businessman Pedro Carmona. The channel's owner, Guillermo Zuluaga, was arrested in 2010 for broadcasting false information about the coup. And now, with the government feeling particularly vulnerable, Globovisión's challenge to Chávez's presidency hasn't gone down well. CONATEL, Venezuela's media regulatory authority, is investigating the channel for inciting violence. It's the 8th legal standoff between the government and the broadcaster and could result in a hefty fine, or the channel could be taken off the air for 3 days.
CONATEL just zoomed in on Globovisión, and their investigation will probably end up in a fine. How they justify the punishment is irrelevant. It could be anything. A guest could say something on an opinion show, and the government could use that to get rid of the channel. It's like Damocles' sword is hanging over them.
We are being punished for informing. We've been waiting for an official to come and give us their version, and all we want to do is put his position on screen and to broadcast it. And because we don't have that, we broadcast something else.
Globovisión has argued that the postponement of Chávez's inauguration is a violation of the Constitution, and of course what this means is that this particular channel is aligning itself with the opposition and trying to seize the opportunity to create a power vacuum that might be favorable to the opposition.
The battle between Globovisión and Chávez is emblematic of Venezuela's polarized media landscape. Private business interests own around 70% of the country's radio and TV stations. Those include RCTV, Venevisión and Televen, who have been forced to tone down criticism of the government in the past few years. The government directly owns only around 5% of the media in Venezuela. The remaining 25% is community-owned, where the state can and often does play a major role. In the past decade, the government embarked on an aggressive drive to acquire more media real estate, up from 1 TV channel to 6. Those channels include TVS, Vive and Telesur, a news channel based in Caracas that broadcasts across Latin America.
The story of Chávez and the media isn't unique to Chávez, but it is singular to left-leaning leaders in Latin America who are confronting media who belong to monopolistic economic groups. Chávez has created another space for the formation of opinion and information. He has used the resources of the state in order to first create a state-owned alternative media, but also to acquire a stake in formerly purely private media, including Globovisión. The government owns 25% of the stake in Globovisión, in order to try and balance things up.
Hay un estilo populista
Chávez's populist approach to reaching the people on the ground has been very successful. There is no doubt that he has put Venezuela's poor on the front page. The language the president uses,
You are a donkey, Mr. Bush.
the fact that he's a natural storyteller, he breaks out into song. His speeches touch on national folklore.
Todo el pueblo venezolano, muchas gracias.
All of this he's done very effectively by using the media.
Yo soy un ser humano como cualquiera de ustedes.
The fact is, Chávez the TV construct has been central to this political movement. But that dependence on the cult of personality is being tested, with many on both sides of the political divide asking if Chavismo, the cult of Chávez, can survive in the absence of Chávez himself. Even his former communications minister and one of the chief architects of the media overhaul admits there's a problem.
The challenge for state media is to attract a larger audience. There are so many ways and means of delivering our message, but public media isn't bold enough. We have lots more to do. We haven't managed to build a media apparatus that can take our message effectively to the masses.
In the case of Chávez and his relationship with state media, there is always the danger that he becomes the sole protagonist of the story. Better coverage would be one that focuses also how the social movements are inventing political institutions of their own. That story tends not to be told, and there is always a risk that if you concentrate solely on the figure, once the figure is absent, you find yourself without the real story.
Because the real story in Venezuela is not about the cult of Hugo Chávez. The real story the media must tell is the story of El Pueblo, the story of the people.
More Global Village voices now on the Venezuelan media's ongoing war over Hugo Chávez.
Chávez has always been critical of the privately owned media in his country. He somehow sees himself as a fighter of big interest in the benefit of the people. In doing so, he's practically blocked any real attempt to controvert his government. So he wants to tackle the problem of a possible bias in the privately owned media by shutting them down altogether. I suppose media outlets in the hands of just a few businessmen is as detrimental to democracy as other representation of the government.
After the coup, so many Venezuelans lost their faith in Venezuelan media, and they didn't know who to believe, and so they started to create their own coverage, which the government now subsidizes. And so while the common criticism is that community and state media is just a government mouthpiece and just reproduces government ideology, a lot of media barrio producers would say that media is being democratized in Venezuela.
Finally, our viral video this week is a little bit different. Usually, we like to lighten things up at this stage, not get all dark and moody. But we're looking at a piece of work by an animator named Steve Cutts. This is a guy who once did a short film about a zombie apocalypse at the design office where he works in Shoreditch, East London. The animation we're looking at is called Man. Now, evolution is often depicted through those images of that ape on all fours slowly rising up to become the modern man walking tall. Cutts offers a more sinister take, and he questions whether the human race with its destructive tendencies is evolving up or going down. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.